A quick word about Up First from NPR. Breaking news, as you've probably noticed, is pretty broken. You're constantly doom scrolling on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, or X, or whatever we're calling it, and maybe you feel a little bit of, I'm over it, I'm over the news. Well, if this sounds like you, I recommend that you listen to the Up First podcast from NPR. You get everything you need to know in an easy 15-minute update. Look, if you listen to this show, it is very likely that you follow the news and you care about politics, just like me. But I think one of the best choices you can make is decide how to engage with the news. And Up First is a perfect way to distill down to just the information you need to help you understand the news without getting overwhelmed and feeling that sense of news paralysis. Up First is national and international. There's facts and information, but there's also personality and analysis. Start your day every day with Up First. Change the way that you consume the news. Listen now to the Up First podcast from NPR. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, February 21st, 1928, an 847-page report starts to paint a deeper picture of just how devastating the effect of Indian boarding schools was in this country's history. The report was submitted to the Secretary of the Interior and was the first general study of Native American conditions since the 1850s. The report found generally that the federal government was failing at its goals of protecting Native Americans, protecting their land, their resources, both personal and cultural. And a lot of this was related to this practice of so-called Indian boarding schools, where students were Americanized, but also suffered greatly. So here to discuss what we know and don't know about the Native American boarding schools are, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
Now, as I introduce our guest listeners, let me reset the timeline a little bit for you, because let's take a look here. A lot of those schools were set up in the mid-1800s. The report we're talking about today was in the 1920s. The schools lasted until about the 1960s or so. And here we are in the 2020s, and we are still learning new information. In fact, it could be that some 3,000 Native American children died while in custody of the U.S. government in these schools. And that number comes from a new investigation in the Washington Post, came out just in the last couple months. It's a number that is much higher than has been in any other report. Dana Hedgpeth is a journalist who has been at the Washington Post for 25 years. She is also an enrolled member of the Halawa-Saponi tribe of North Carolina. She was one of the main reporters behind this new investigation and is here to discuss her reporting and this practice of Native boarding schools. Dana, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for your incredible investigation.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to get into what you found in your study and then, of course, the history of boarding schools. But not to start too meta, but, we are hooking this to, in 1928, there's this report that gets submitted to the Secretary of the Interior. It is the first report since the 1850s. You have your reporting now. Can you just paint a picture of why it seems like generation after generation, it's been hard to just get basic information about what took place inside these Native boarding schools?
Very good question. And I think we're still asking ourselves that in 2025. Part of it, it's a couple of different answers to that. One is the records. In general, records on Native Americans are just sadly not good. They often weren't kept at all. Remember, Native Americans were considered wards of the state. There just was not good record keeping at all. So it is very hard to get accurate records. Secondly, at the boarding schools, there was no systematic way they were all run. There's about more than 400 across the country. Some were run by the federal government alone. Some were run under contracts with the government by various religious institutions. And every school did it slightly different of how they kept records and where those records ended up when they closed. We've heard reports of where some schools, a new Catholic order would come in and they just would throw the files literally out in the snow. I always sadly say that I've never heard of more fires, strangely, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes, at Indian boarding schools. They always seem to have fires and boxes of records are lost. Very mysterious, again, doing air quotes of why they seem to have records just lost. There are tons of records at the National Archives, which is usually the best source for many of the records. Those are organized in a way that I would say is not it's not as easy as just searching Google these days, right? You can't just. Many of them are online. Many of them are not. They're in microfilm, and I always joked with my colleagues that you could find 12 dissertations by going around to all the various national archives and pulling those microfilms. I would love to do that, but we work on a deadline.
You're talking to two people here who are very used to going into the archives and searching.
I'm like, oh, that sounds amazing. Did you have to get glasses in this process? Because the microfilm is no joke, going through those reels and reels of microfilm.
Yes, they are no joke. And then when you get to one, and I already have bad eyesight, so it's like I'm blowing it up to 225% to try to read a cursive document, or it's sideways, and then you're asking a colleague to look at it. So it's a needle in the haystack looking through some of these records. They are there, but it's just a matter of the time and looking through it. So that's part of the answer of why we're still looking for answers. And the other thing is, sadly, there's a shame to this history. This is a long forgotten, often ignored, and some folks don't even know about it. And even for boarding school survivors, I've spent 18 months doing several stories. We've done 2 big investigations into this. And there is a certain sad shame to what happened at those boarding schools for Native Americans who survived and went to them. I'm Native American, and you'll hear us refer to folks who went to boarding schools as survivors, not former students, because they really did survive a very hard time of their life.
Can you talk a little bit about what is happening in the schools? Because this is not like reading, writing, arithmetic. I mean, this is, a lot of these schools are assimilationist schools. They're meant to sort of, like you said, strip children of their language, their culture, their identity. How long are they in these schools? Is this a K through 12 thing? Is this how, and what does sort of everyday life look like?
Okay, first off, in Indian history and boarding schools 101, real quick, throw out everything we know in modern times of school systems. These are nothing like, quote unquote, the schools that my children, your children would go to. Okay, first off, these schools had cemeteries. I hope that your child's school does not have a cemetery instead of a playground. Mine certainly doesn't. The idea of K through 12 also, throw that out. These schools were teaching the very basics of reading, writing, arithmetic. Students spent half their days learning very basic skills. Remember, many of these students showed up and spoke their tribal languages. They were taken from their homes. I've talked to so many survivors who said, I didn't even know what I was getting punished for because I couldn't even understand the language. They were being taught by just pure memorization. Teachers told it, pencil, repeat, pencil, pencil, over and over. They really didn't have a concept of learning language the way we do now, these concepts of phonics and curriculum and all of this. That was just non-existent. Students were doing things because they were told or hit or punished. And when you lose that and you strip someone of their culture, not just the emotional, you're talking about knowledge that's lost, and that's powerful and sad.
And I think it's worth underscoring that this was not just something that was lost, but it was something that was stolen. This was the project of these boarding schools, that they were part of essentially like a tool of ethnic cleansing to not necessarily kill the people, although, as you point out, people died going to these boarding schools, but to kill their culture and their cultural identity and to replace it with something more like a Western white identity. And that, I think, is not unconnected from the lack of historical knowledge that we have, right? It's the identities that are being erased, but it's also this history that has been erased in those fires that you've talked about, and just erased under both shame, but also under like the memory making and sense making of the imperial project that took these cultural identities from these children.
But it's also not even about taking on like a white identity, because it's not as though, you were saying, Dana, it's not as though they left to become accountants and doctors and lawyers and, you know, were sort of like thriving in a traditional American society way. I mean, this is exploitation of, and almost exploitation without a means. Going back to what you said about like being able to like, you know, shoe a horse, like how is that useful for their daily lives when they leave these spaces? And so there's so much that is lost and stolen. I think that's perfect word.
Hey, it's Jody with a word about a fellow Radiotopia show, The Recipe. So, I don't know about you, but with inflation and grocery prices what they are, and the fact that it's pretty cold where I live, I am spending a lot more time in my kitchen, cooking recipes for me and my family and friends. The good old-fashioned dinner party, by the way, it's coming back. Give it a shot. I think this is the year we're going to become the home cooks we were all meant to be. And one of our newer Radiotopia shows is here to help on our culinary journey. It is The Recipe with Kenji and Deb. Kenji and Deb, of course, are J. Kenji Lopez-Alt and Deb Perlman, two of the best home cooks alive. I'm sure you know Kenji's YouTube, his contributions to the New York Times recipes, Deb's iconic cooking blog, Smitten Kitchen. I actually just went to my saved recipes on the New York Times cooking app to see which of Kenji's recipes were on there, and there are a ton. I like to make his vegan chili, his Taiwanese beef noodle soup. He has a great salmon recipe, and most importantly, he's the one that really got me to learn how to scramble eggs to perfection. So, The Recipe. In each episode, Kenji and Deb talk about the essential ingredients and techniques of a beloved everyday dish, the little things that make a dish really sing. One of the things I really love about this is that they have different styles and they sometimes disagree. That makes for a great podcast, and it's kind of the beauty of cooking. You have to figure out what works for you. And The Recipe is there to help. So, go ahead and check it out from Radiotopia and PRX, The Recipe with Kenji and Deb. You can listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Happy cooking. So, we're a few weeks into the new year. Do you feel like a new you? One opportunity we get to reimagine ourselves can come through a new wardrobe. Seriously, refreshing your clothes can go a long way. And this year, I've resolved to keep my look fresh while also trying to stay on a budget. Luckily, there's Quince. Let's go through a few early year wardrobe items. It might be cold wherever you're listening to this right now. Well, how about a Mongolian cashmere sweater? $50. Maybe you've resolved to hit the gym more? Okay, well, there's plenty of activewear options from sports bras to leggings. New year, new business. You want to look sharp in suits and blazers. They're on there as well. For me, we're going to be doing a lot more video episodes of this podcast this year, and I'm not going to go out there looking like a schlub. So keep an eye out when you watch those for some classy sweaters and button downs. I can get it together when I need to, folks, and Quince is going to help. Upgrade your closet this year without the upgraded price tag. Go to quince.com/thisday for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday.
I think you both nailed it. I mean, the philosophy of these schools, remember, many of them are modeled after Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which was founded in 1879 by Richard Henry Pratt, who was a former Civil War veteran and had fought in the Indian Wars in the West. And he had this idea. He actually got it from Hampton in Virginia, where former slaves were being, quote unquote, retrained, right? And he got this idea that he would start a similar school for Native Americans. And sadly, again, these are terrible viewpoints in my opinion, but they were the philosophy of the time, that Native Americans being of lighter skin could be, quote unquote, assimilated into white society. Pratt developed his school in Carlisle, and he became literally a model for many large schools to open across the country. And his philosophy was simply this: kill the Indian in him, save the man. It blows my mind, and you can hear my passion of how there just was no real regulation or oversight of these schools. And it was thought to be perfectly fine that if they were, quote, in white households, they would learn to be white.
So to that point, let's talk a little bit about reform or lack thereof over the decades and decades. But actually, to your point about this not being ancient history, I mean, the schools, their peak was in the 1970s, right? There were 60,000 kids enrolled in the 70s, right before it all kind of got shut down. So it's, it's kind of amazing. But okay, let's talk about reform, and let's come back to this moment we're marking here. 1928, this report gets issued. One interesting little tidbit is it gets issued by an organization that then ends up being what is now known as the Brookings Institution. So it's
right.
So,
I'm glad you brought up that history.
Yeah, it's a nice little tidbit there.
Right.
But it gets issued, and it lays out a lot of the problems in these schools. It points out the conditions, abuse. It says that the staff is not adequately prepared. It's overcrowded. There's very few medical services. It kind of reaches President Hoover. He requests additional funds, but it doesn't really seem to have much of a material impact. And so, if we write the story of these schools, is it the case that's basically like they get set up in the mid 1800s and they get shut down in the mid to late 1900s? Is there really no reform in that whole stretch throughout?
There's really not. The Merriam report, as you said the schools had poor conditions, bad diets, overcrowding, underfunded, and understaffed. There were stories of, we've seen journals from teachers at the schools who say they were responsible for feeding, dressing, and teaching 60 children, 7 days a week. That's still no excuse for abuse and mistreatment, but these were tough conditions for all. The Merriam report, as you said, did not immediately lead to changes in policy. Remember, these are part of a larger assimilation policy of the federal government that goes back since contact, right? This is not just, they didn't just pop up with this idea of Indian boarding schools. This comes after decades of the Indian Wars, where literally we had secretaries of wars who said, it's too expensive to fight an Indian. Let's try to go for the children. There is no better way to crush a culture, whether you are an alien, purple, black, white, polka dot, than to take their children. Okay? We all across the country, no matter where you come from, your children are the next generation. That's your future. That's how you teach of who you are. Everyone can relate to that. Even aliens, I imagine, can relate to that, right? That is the way you pass down who you are. It is such a crushing thing to say we are going for the children. David Wallace Adams calls this, this was the next Indian War. Because if you take the elders or those who were adults by then, they couldn't kill them all. And they were saying it cost too much. They were losing their own men. So let's take the children so that they don't learn to be Indian, literally. They do not learn their native ways, their tribal ways, who they are. If you take them as young as 5, they will not know.
Yeah. Wow.
This was maybe probably 2 or 3 years ago when my kids were a little bit younger, and we're huge fans of PBS Kids. And we were watching Molly Denali, and they did a whole episode on boarding schools and the experience that Molly's grandfather had. And they did it in such, from my perspective, a very careful, but very, way that children could understand, like, how terrible these schools were and the impact that they had on children and on grandparents and the people that experienced it. And even just being able to tell these stories, because part of the violence is also the erasure of just covering it up and not even talking about this past, is so important as well. Like the journalism work that you're doing, the work that others are doing to sort of recover these stories and these voices is a part of that, like, recovery process.
I want to get to that work that you did. One little tidbit for listeners that just sort of kind of tie a bunch of things together. Listeners may know a couple months ago now, I think we did an episode that was tied to the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which was one of the first moments that the U.S. government tried to unwind some of this, and it's referred to as the Indian New Deal. Our episode, if people recall, was sort of about how complicated and fraught and all the sort of like unforeseen ripple effects of that, where, kind of relatively arbitrary lines about tribal affiliation were drawn in the course of trying to kind of piece things back together. I bring that up just to point out, like, how broken things were as a result of this, that even the attempt to then kind of restore was almost impossible because things were so fractured and things had been hollowed out for so many generations. Yeah.
And let me piggyback on that a little bit. You asked why the Merriam report didn't have more of an impact. Let's little perspective here. I am obsessed with Native American history, so I have to jam it in anytime I can.
You're on a history podcast, so you're in the right
this is the time.
My colleagues tease me and my kids tease me that, but it's so important to step back and think that Native Americans just did not even gain U.S. citizenship until 1924. Just sit with that for a minute. You're talking about, even the adult, people say, well, why would you send your child to a boarding school? They had no choice. There were policies in place that mandated. It was the law. By this point in time, very quick history here. Let's think about this for a second. Native Americans had been literally invaded. Gone were the buffalo, our main source of food, shelter, nomadic hunting. They were trying to end that. They had taken lands, pushed Native Americans on reservations. You couldn't even leave your reservation without the permission of a superintendent or agent. They had no power. When you have no power, you have no control over your children or your own life. Okay, that is a very hard concept for so many people to get, but if you just sit with that for a second, when you are powerless and not a citizen, and you're being literally threatened that you will not get your government rations of food if you do not send your children to these boarding schools, tell me what choices people really had.
Yeah.
But that is why that Merriam report had little to no effect. Well, it's a voluminous report. Native Americans were just not seen in the 1920s when that report came out as being citizens. They did not have the same kind of equal rights. And that's the simplest reason of why that report, while it did shine a spotlight on it and did recognize many of the poor conditions, it really had no impact in changing those schools greatly.
So there's a big difference between that and I think some of the journalism that's being done right now to try to uncover these histories, whether it's, you mentioned the stories of the boarding schools in Canada and the deaths associated with that. There's been a lot of really incredible reporting on the stolen generations in Australia. And then your own reporting that has uncovered, Jody mentioned earlier, 3,000 deaths. Can you talk a little bit about the process of piecing that together and what you draw from such a high death toll from these schools?
That's right. Our piece was published in late December, and we found that more than 3,100 Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian students died at these Indian boarding schools that were run by the U.S. government from the early 1800s until 1970. I had the privilege of working with an incredible team of reporters. Sari Horowitz, who's an award-winning journalist and has done reporting in Indian country, a data team, a visual forensics team. We dug into hundreds of thousands of records, and we found nearly twice the number of burial sites that were documented by the federal government, and we found 3 times the number of children who died. And people say, well, why is there such a difference? The reason is, in large part, the Interior Department said in their own investigation that they were limited in scope. They themselves said they didn't tell the full story of the trauma of these boarding schools. They looked at federal records. We looked at those, built upon that, and then took it a step further by looking at census rolls, death records in schools, historical maps, archival newspaper records. We built upon research done by so many out there, both in Indian country and outside of Indian countries. There's 2 researchers who are fantastic at Chemawa in Oregon who have spent 20 years researching almost 200 children's deaths at that school.
So just to be clear, I mean, your number 3,000 is about 3 times as high as some of the previous numbers floating around, but you're kind of saying that the number is likely much higher.
You know, and that's a very good point. No one really knows, is the honest truth of how many children. 2 big factors that people don't know. No one has an exact count of how many Native American children attended these boarding schools over 150 years, and no one knows exactly how many died, sadly. The death records are incomplete. They were often more likely to tell you of how many crops were raised or sold or how many aprons were sewn and weaved versus the children's deaths. It just makes me cringe every time I think about it. If they would say, if the flu swept through the dormitories and we lost 2 souls. That's it.
Well, look, I mean, like, you know, a good historian and like a good journalist, you're just kind of adding to an ongoing story, you know, and you're not going to write a definitive piece of something this deep and horrific and hidden. But we really appreciate the work you've done. We will link listeners to Dana's piece, obviously, in the show notes, and you can go find it on the Washington Post. But Dana Hedgpeth, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for all your work.
Thank you for having me and for listening to the work that our team did.
Yeah. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.